Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about early childhood psychosocial development. This is part 3, our section on emotion regulation, problem behaviors, and parenting. As we discuss the social and emotional development of children, it's important to keep in mind that while we may talk about the biological underpinnings, one of the most important influences in how these skills develop for children is the involvement of their parents. So their interactions with caring adults are a really important aspect of developing these foundational skills for their psychosocial development. As young children in the early childhood period are learning about emotion regulation, they really do it through their interaction with others. That can occur with playmates, but in the early years, they probably get most of their learning through parents navigating for them what other people might think or feel as they are interacting with them. Two of the very, very important social skills that develop at this time are empathy, which is a sense, an understanding of the emotions and concerns of others, and prosocial behavior, which is basically behaving in such a way that you're being helpful and kind and doing things purely for the interests of others. Prosocial behavior is thought to increase quite remarkably between the ages of 3 and 6. As empathy develops and children understand that other people have separate emotions than they do, theory of mind kinds of things, they also begin to understand that they can comfort someone who's feeling distress, and that person, when they feel better, that is also kind of reinforcing to the person doing the comforting. So to expand, the aspects of behavior that we don't want to see increase in young children can be described by these terms: antipathy and antisocial behavior. Antipathy is when you feel dislike, disdain, or even hatred for another person, and that sense of not caring for them can lead to antisocial behavior, which is defined as deliberately hurting another person, including somebody who is vulnerable or has done no harm to the person. So for children learning how to regulate their emotions, we hope that we are helping them to develop more prosocial behaviors and fewer antisocial behaviors. Some of the problem behaviors that can emerge in early childhood fall under the category of aggression. Aggressive behavior, particularly if it's mild and brief and reactive, is developmentally typical during the early childhood years. If it becomes more intentional, more persistent, and basically where there is no necessarily observable function of the aggressive behavior, it's not to get a toy or to get attention, but it seems to actually bring pleasure to the individual who's acting that way, that's when we become more clinically concerned. So researchers in the area of child development recognize 4 different kinds of aggression: instrumental, reactive, relational, and bullying. And we're going to look at each one of these in turn. The idea being that as a young child learns how to regulate emotion, you would hope to see more prosocial behaviors and fewer antisocial, or in this case, aggressive behaviors. So instrumental aggression is hurtful behavior that's aimed at getting something, such as a preferred toy, such as a place in line. Idea being that a young child might be so focused on what they want that they don't stop to think about what it will mean to another child if they hit them on their way of getting it. So instrumental aggression often increases from age 2 to age 6, usually involves being aggressive towards objects, maybe throwing a toy as opposed to hitting a person. And as I mentioned, it's pretty normal. It's also a bit more about being self-involved or egocentric, thinking about one's own needs, as opposed to being deliberately antisocial or against others' needs. Second type is reactive aggression. This is an impulsive kind of act when somebody feels hurt, either because of an accident or another person's intentional action, and the child responds by either being verbally or physically aggressive. Usually, this kind of aggression is related to poor emotion regulation, primarily not stopping and thinking, gathering one's feelings, and then behaving. It's just a quick response because the child hasn't yet learned how to put the brakes on their feelings. We do see these sorts of aggressive acts in 2-year-olds to 3-year-olds. Developmentally, you would expect a 4.5 or 5-year-old to be better able to put the brakes on and not behave in this way. Relational aggression refers to non-physical acts, usually things like gossiping or insulting somebody or telling other children not to play with a child. These things are often aimed at harming the social connections of another child and do involve some intentionality on the part of the aggressor. Usually, relational aggression that does involve a personal attack can be thought of as antisocial. It can be very hurtful, and it becomes more common as children become more aware of the thoughts and feelings of others. It is less common in early childhood than it is in middle childhood. But if you see relational aggression as an adult, you want to intervene as soon as possible because relational aggressive acts can often lead to the next type of aggression, which is bullying aggression. These are unprovoked, repeated physical or verbal attacks. They're usually perpetrated on victims that are unlikely to defend themselves. So in a bullying situation, the victim is often chosen on purpose by the bully because the bully sees that person as somehow having less power or being less likely to respond. In both bullies and victims, we see difficulties with emotion regulation. Sometimes children are chosen as victims because they respond with strong emotion, and that's part of what is reinforcing for the bully. It's really important that we intervene as early as possible in bullying aggression. If you start to see it in a 4-year-old, you want to intervene right away as it's likely to persist and even become more intense and more frequent as the child grows into the middle childhood years. Now remember, parents are a huge influence on the development of emotion regulation skills on the child. We opened up our slideshow with that, and that's because parents really differ in the way that they interact with their children. And we refer to these differences in parent behavior as parenting styles. For example, parents may differ in their expressions of warmth and affection. Some may be a little colder, less affectionate, more likely to criticize than to support. Parents also differ in the strategies they use for disciplining a child in order to promote pro-social behavior. The way that parents discipline their children is often strongly related to how they were disciplined when they were children. So sometimes beliefs about discipline are carried through families in a cultural way. Other times, parents will choose their approach to discipline very intentionally to either be like how they were parented or not be like how they were parented. But regardless of how they get there, parents do vary in when they decide to teach or explain how to behave to their children, when they criticize, when they try to persuade, and when they try to punish. Parents also differ in their expectations for a child's maturity. Some parents may require more responsibility and self-control than others at different ages. And sometimes preschool teachers, pediatricians, child psychologists, and other therapists often need to work with parents to develop realistic expectations about what their young children should be expected to do. And lastly, parents differ in how they communicate. Some are good listeners, and others really prefer to raise a family where the child is supposed to maybe not speak unless spoken to. They prefer more silence and quiet on the child's behalf. So these sort of aspects of parenting style not only reflect the individual temperament of the parent, but can also reflect the culture of the family. In fact, when scientists look at parenting style, they find that in different cultures, certain parenting strategies are often valued differently than in other cultures. But regardless of differences in parenting practices, if there is overly harsh parenting, if the parent lacks warmth and affection for the child, that appears to be harmful for child development regardless of the culture you are raised within. In fact, a parent's affection is a really important part of helping a child develop into a secure adult. So while parenting is hard work and we may feel like we misstep and wish we had handled certain things differently, it's important to keep in mind that ongoing, unconditional regard, where you just love your kid and you're affectionate and warm, can go a long way toward helping that child grow up with healthy social and emotional foundations. Given all these different styles of parenting, several researchers have hypothesized different styles of parenting or caregiving that we could then use as a field when we are doing research on which style tends to work best for which children. So Baumrind is a scientist who pioneered work in parenting styles, and she came up with 4 styles, 3 of which are listed here. Authoritarian parenting is when the parents have pretty high standards for the child's behavior. They use strict punishment methods. There's very little compromise, and they also tend to not explain their parenting procedures or even explain their expectations to their children. So it is not necessarily very warm, and there isn't a lot of communication, but expectations are high and clear. Permissive parenting is kind of the opposite of authoritarian parenting. In permissive parenting, there's a high amount of warmth and nurturance. There's a lot of communication, but there may be very few limits, very little consistent methods of discipline, and there may be less parent time taken to guide or try to teach the child how to control his or her behavior. Permissive parenting tends to be less rule governed, but high in warmth and nurturance. Third style, which is thought in most cases to be the most adaptive style, is authoritative parenting. This is when parents are high in warmth and communication, and they also are clear about their expectations and their limits. So they set limits, they enforce the limits, they have rules, but they are willing to be flexible about rules given the specific circumstances that might be happening in the moment. So there is more back and forth communication in an authoritative parenting style. So in some ways one might say it takes the best of authoritarian and the best of permissive and has a more balanced approach. Now, since Baumrind first presented her model, a 4th style has been added over time, and this is neglectful or uninvolved parenting. This is where, unfortunately, parents are indifferent or not really invested in their children, appear to be unaware of what's going on in their lives, and usually are responding in a way that is not related to what the child does. We would call this inconsistent or non-contingent responding. So a parent who maybe one moment is very responsive and caring because they feel like it and they're in the mood, and then the next moment they feel stressed and so they're harsh and cold and withdrawn. Neglectful, uninvolved parenting is thought to be the least healthy or adaptive approach to raising a child. So when we look at this chart, it summarizes for Baumrind's 3 initial parenting styles, each of them on the dimensions of warmth, discipline, expectations, and communication. As you can see, these styles differ from each other, and this is an important aspect of the research to be familiar with, particularly as you're preparing for the exam on this particular section. Parenting styles have been demonstrated by researchers to have long-term effects on child development. They have looked at children of authoritarian, permissive, authoritative, and neglectful parents. They find that children of authoritarian parents, that's that first group that's very rule-governed and not flexible or warm, those children tend to become pretty conscientious and obedient. They tend to be quiet, but they're not especially happy. They feel guilty easily, can become depressed, blame themselves when things don't go well, even when it's not within their control to make them better. Many times, children of authoritarian parents tend to rebel as teenagers, and they're more likely than children raised by parents with other styles to leave home before the age of 20. Children of permissive parents tend to be relatively unhappy, actually, and lack self-control, especially in peer relationships, and it can be very hard for them to find balanced reciprocity in their relationships with others. They tend to suffer from inadequate emotion regulation skills. It's harder for them to put the brakes on their own emotions. They tend to be perceived as pretty self-involved, somewhat immature, and often lack sustaining friendships, which is strongly associated with their risk for depression. Unfortunately, children raised by permissive parents tend to live at home for longer, tend to be dependent on their parents for longer, particularly through their 20s. Children of authoritative parents, remember this is kind of the balanced style with the clear expectations, clear rules, but also high warmth and some flexibility. Those children are most likely to be successful, articulate, happy with themselves, and generous with others. They're more likely to be well liked by teachers and peers, and their initiative is often seen as better developed than children raised by either overly controlling parents, authoritarian, or parents who aren't teaching any controls or discipline, permissive. Then lastly, children of neglectful or uninvolved parents tend to be more immature, more sad, lonely, at risk of depression, at risk of injury, and unfortunately, risk of abuse, not only as children, but as adults. So parenting style does seem to have significant impact on the psychosocial development of individuals. It is important to note that there are some problems with the research on parenting style. Most of the research has not been done in families with widely different economic circumstances, nor does it reflect the diversity of different cultures, races, or ethnic backgrounds as much as it should. There needs to be more focus on the attitudes that parents have, and a little less probably on daily interactions and how they act, as much as understanding more what parents believe and how they're thinking about their children. There's also a dearth of recognition that there are authoritarian parents, particularly those who come from a strong religious background, who are loving and may have a combination of warmth with high expectations. That subgroup is not well reflected in the literature. There's also very little recognition of how some parents who are more permissive in what they allow behaviorally may actually provide verbal instruction. In other words, high in communication. That subgroup has also been ignored in the research. And lastly, the research on parenting style doesn't do a great job of taking into account the temperament of the child or how the child's behavioral style is going to be challenging perhaps to the parent, and how a parent's interaction with the child is also shaped by the child's responses to that parent. So parenting style research tells us some very important things, but there are also some limits. The last aspect of parenting and emotion regulation I'd like to cover today has to do with discipline, or what parents do when they're trying to teach their children to behave differently. An important topic is physical punishment. Now, some researchers believe that physical punishment is harmless, and there are some studies that suggest that mild, infrequent physical punishment does not have long-term effects on the social emotional functioning of children over time. Other researchers don't buy into that way of thinking and will cite that longitudinal research suggests that children who are physically punished are more likely to be disobedient, more likely to become bullies and delinquents, and more likely to become abusive as adults. These longitudinal studies also suggest that children who have been disciplined through primarily physical means perform less well in school and often quit before entering college. Research on children who are not physically disciplined finds that those who aren't spanked tend to develop more self-control. As physical punishment increases, so does misbehavior, and the correlation between spanking and later aggression actually holds for children of all ethnic groups across all cultures internationally. So in general, physical punishment can increase obedience temporarily, but it also increases the possibility of later bullying, later delinquency, and later abusive behaviors. Physical punishment is also associated with delays in understanding the perspectives and thoughts of other people, which we call theory of mind. And physical punishment has been associated with concurrent increases in aggression in young children. So if a child is being spanked, that child is more likely to use physical acting out behavior in their play with other children. So if we were wondering if spanking is okay, so that concludes part 3 of chapter 10 on social and emotional development of children. Emotional regulation is a really important developmental task in early childhood, and the lessons learned during this time are going to help shape the social and emotional functioning of an individual for years to come. Thanks for your time and attention.